So hi everyone. Last time we talked a little bit about my live performance rig and how that's going together, and I'm making some modifications by building my own MIDI controller that is designed to function more like an organ, because the primary source of sound I use in my music is pipe organ sounds, and I use an emulator software called Hauptwerk, and I needed at least one keyboard on the rig that actually worked like an organ. So another project I'm doing is I'm working on 3 different old electronic organs, and we're going to make 3 different types of MIDI conversions. Now the first one is going to be my old 33E. Now if you go back in my channel, and probably a couple years ago, I did a whole series of videos on repairs and modifications I did to this organ built in 1970. And we had a lot of fun with that. I rebuilt the power supply. I added a preamp to separate the percussions out and have them run on a separate channel. Switched some voices around, and I even had a plan for building a circuit to create an oboe voice, and so had a lot of fun with that. And well, I walked into this studio one day and I was looking around, and at that time I didn't just have this organ. I had a gigantic 4-manual classical organ. I had a Hammond Model A, and I was looking at this place, and it occurred to me that all of this stuff was in the way of me enjoying any of it. So I made the bold decision that I really needed to just have one standard organ console. And using the Hauptwerk system, which is the computer-based organ emulator, I can have any kind of organ I want on there. And the fact that I'll be controlling a classical organ much of the time from a theater organ console, Hauptwerk doesn't care. If I'm going to play a theater organ from a theater organ console, Hauptwerk doesn't care. So I sat down at the 2 consoles, the big classical console and then my 33E, and I did that decluttering technique that is sometimes talked about, where you take an object and you say, gosh, does this make me happy? Does this bring back fond memories? Well, maybe that's the thing to keep. And then when you grab another object and you hold it in your hand and you say, well, this doesn't make me happy, then it's time to get rid of it. Well, when I sat down at that big 4-manual console, there's video of me playing that thing. I sat down at that, and I just felt like, there's things about this that are kind of frustrating. And so I decided, that's the one that has to go. When I sat down at my old 33E here, well, even though it's built to be just a theater organ platform, it made me happy, because my introduction to the organ was theater organ. It happened to be a theater organ in a pizza parlor. And I'm one of probably 5 people in the world who can say I walked into a pizza parlor and it changed my life. At any rate, I have, dug into any number of these old Rogers analog organs, made modifications, and I've always had the policy that I make the modifications in such a way that they can be reversed. So I'm not going to get rid of any of the old electronics. I'm going to disconnect, and then I'm going to insert some MIDI encoders. Now this particular encoder comes from DTS MIDI Systems. Good quality product. It's about $200 each though. So these add up pretty quick when you're trying to convert an old console. I'm also looking into building my own MIDI encoders from scratch. Been doing some research on that, and it turns out there's a number of ways to do that. So as we get into this project, we're going to explore some of that and how I'm going about that. Again, building my very own MIDI encoders will allow me not only to do what I want, it'll allow me to have the exact functionality that I need for, say, my live rig and some of the odd things that I do there, and have the organ console really behave like an organ console. So let's take a quick look at this. Now, if you go back to 1970 when this was built, there's no multiplexing and matrixing and those kinds of things that were very common with electronics today. Every key on the organ, every stop switch was a discrete circuit and then went into all of this stuff. This happens to be the pedal board. So I have a discrete wire from each and every key contact on the pedal board, and those can simply be desoldered there and soldered in here, because this encoder uses discrete contacts for each and every note. It then multiplexes and processes it to become a MIDI signal. There's a bunch of ways to do that, and we're going to explore that along the way. So if we look at this, this is how they did it back in the 70s. My goodness. That's a lot of stuff. So if we come over here, we've got the keyboards. And again, discrete wire on every note. And as you can see, just like the pedal board situation, I can simply desolder these wires from their connection here on this circuitry, and then I can put those onto a MIDI encoder of some kind, either a DTS or the one I make myself. And should somebody want to take this organ and restore all these old electronics, they can do that. And, you know, I think it sounds kind of crazy that somebody would take an old electronic organ that by modern standards doesn't really sound like much and restore it, but some people do that. And that's why I'm a little reticent to just gut this thing and throw all this equipment away. I've never done that. I've always made those modifications reversible, and I think I'm going to continue that with this. Somebody could do it, and you know, if they want to down the road. Any rate, so in upcoming videos, we're going to see how I actually go about doing some of this wiring and setting this up to be a MIDI controller, both on my live rig, on this organ, and then there's two more organs that I'm going to be working on, and those are at another shop right now, and we're going to be taking a look at that. Now today, on this video, I wanted to answer a viewer question. And a person was looking at one of my older videos about this instrument when we were, making modifications and repairs. And he asked me, how do these tone generators work? And I thought, that's a great question. These are transistor oscillators, but that's not the only way that organs have ever generated tone. The first way was with an electromechanical system called a tone wheel. So let's start by understanding something about sound that we don't always think about. If a tree falls in a forest and nobody's around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, technically, no, it does not. And here's why. Sound, as we understand it, is how our brain interprets compression waves in the air as converted into nerve impulses by our ears. So, that tree falls. It generates compression waves for sure. It generates a vibration in the ground. But unless there's an animal that has a sense of hearing, there's no sound yet, because sound is a mental interpretation. So let's take, say, a snake, or and lots of other reptiles. They do have kind of a, you might call a proto-hearing. I know you biologists are going to get after me about that. But really, their senses are about vibration. They can sense vibrations in the air, and they can sense vibrations in the ground. So they are going to feel, understand, perceive that a tree has fallen down. Birds, mammals, have a sense of hearing similar to ours. It's a little more sophisticated. And they are going to hear some kind of sound as a result of that tree falling. So how does that relate to electronic sound that we hear? So let's take an electric guitar. You have the strings, and then you have the pickups. And the pickups are these little magnetic coils, and the strings are above that. And when the strings are vibrating, they are inducing an electrical current, a variable electrical current. So let's say this string here is vibrating at A above middle C, 440 cycles. Well, it's inducing a pulse current at 440 cycles. That's amplified. The speaker cone is vibrating at 440 cycles a second, and that is generating a compression wave in the air, and that's what we perceive as sound. The tone wheel on the Hammond organ did a similar thing. You had your induction coil, your little, it's a core with a coil of wire around it, and then a wheel would spin, and that wheel was shaped around its edge. And so as the wheel is turning, that edge is moving in and out near that induction coil. And that's doing the same thing as like the string vibrating. It's inducing a variable electric signal. That variation in the electricity going along is amplified. The speaker cone vibrates accordingly. That is what generates the compression waves, and that's what we hear in our ears as sound. So, let's take a transistor oscillator. Now these big circles here are an induction coil, and those are actually the control. The meat of the matter is the transistor. So let's see if I can illustrate a transistor with my hand. Alright, so let's say my hand here is the body of the transistor, and this is our VCC connection, our source. This is our emitter, and my arm is the base of the transistor. So let's say I have a voltage here, a current source, and it's just always on, but I don't have anything going on at the base. Nothing's happening at the emitter, and that's why a transistor is referred to as a semiconductor. Sometimes it's blocking the VCC, the voltage source, from going through. Sometimes, if there's a current at the base to open it up, then everything is flowing and we have a current going out our emitter. Now, in that simple arrangement, we basically have a switch, but we can also have an amplifier. So when that guitar player is vibrating that string, that coil is producing its pulsed current, the amplifier boosts that to where it will drive that speaker cone, and then we hear sound. The amplifier part of that is we have our source, our output, our source, our output, and then we have our base current. That's the signal coming off of the electric guitar. And because it's pulsating and varying and carrying on, the conductive nature of the transistor is mimicking that, but at a higher current. We've got more current coming in here. And when those combine, now we've got enough power to drive that speaker cone. Same thing with the tone wheel. So, we have that amplifier. Now, have you ever been at church or at the auditorium and somebody goes up and they start speaking really softly into the microphone, and then the sound guy, who's maybe a volunteer and not sure of himself, tries to boost that signal, and then you hear the wah feedback. Well, what is happening there is that the amplifier is hearing itself, and it just goes crazy and starts to oscillate. And that's why you hear that whistling sound. That's the oscillation of the amplifier circuit when it hears itself. So we can control that by putting a feedback loop in the form of, in this case, an induction coil that goes from our emitter over to our base. Now we have our VCC coming in. We have our keying signal coming in here. This thing goes conductive, but this, either a resistor or an induction source, what happens here is that feedback loop causes this thing to be unstable. But it's unstable in a predictable way. And so now it's generating that pulsed electrical source, just like the pickup on the guitar, just like the tone wheel of the Hammond organ. The oscillator is generating that pulsed signal. That goes out, it gets amplified. That's what makes the speaker cone vibrate, generating the compression waves, and that's what we hear as sound. So that's how these tone generators work. You can look up more elaborate explanations of oscillators on YouTube. There's a lot of them out there that'll show you exactly on circuit diagrams how these various circuits work. And what, there's obviously a lot more components in here than just the transistor and a feedback loop. And these are tunable, and there's all kinds of stuff going on there. But that's kind of the basics of tone generators and how they do their thing, and I hope that's helpful. And if you want to know more details, I encourage you to look up oscillators on YouTube someday. Next time we're going to take a look at the other two organs that I'm going to be working on and talking a little bit about those. And come back and join me next time.